All right, we are recording. Welcome to the Network Plumbing Working Group meeting for Thursday, June 21st, 2018. As always, I will post the agenda document into the chat, although most people here probably already know where it is. Doesn't matter.
My cockpit didn't work from my email.
Okay, well, there you go. It's in the
You
chat.
saved me, thanks.
So that's the agenda doc, and then there is also the spec document, which has some of the naming stuff in it. So we got a bunch of agenda items today. Spec updates. I did add, as per last meeting, the DNS key to the status map. That would be in like section 5, I think. Sorry. Yes, section 5. There's a lot more information that DNS typically carries, though. So I ended up making that one a map itself that has further keys, name servers, domain, and search. So hopefully that addresses the issue. If anybody has thoughts or comments on that addition, let me know either in the meeting or on the mailing list or whatnot. Pretty straightforward, I would think. And it's optional, of course, you don't have to include it, but the idea there was that I think it was Huawei last time had talked about that maybe they could use that information to further prototype some of their service stuff on those other networks. And we could try to move forward the prototyping of multiple data planes and services and stuff. So assuming that's not very controversial, the next item was Dan Winship had suggested in the comments on the spec IP request and the MAC request keywords in the in the selection annotation. He thought, or his suggestion was to just shorten those to IP and MAC. So I kind of wanted to throw that out to the group. I mean, that sounds, I guess, more or less okay to me. His thought was that the request at the end of IP request and MAC request kind of makes it sound like it's not guaranteed to be honored. So why not just shorten those up? Does anybody have thoughts on that? Does that sound like an okay change or not?
Just for review, is it required to be honored?
Yes. If the status annotation has an IP or a MAC in it, then those are required to be honored.
Wait a minute, status, you mean spec?
Spec, sorry, yes. If the spec.
So can you suggest an IP that you would want to get, then the request would, or is it just a one-way communication with that?
Are you saying you've got a use case for
suggesting? I mean, this is just going one way, right? There's an answer.
Yeah, it's basically in the annotation that says this.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Give me this IP, and if the
exactly.
plugin is not able to provide that IP, then that attachment will fail.
Okay, it fails. It doesn't provide another IP.
No.
Okay. Then I agree. Request makes no sense.
Yep.
Yeah, +1. Let's just call it IP. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, that's fine with me too.
Anonymous Walrus, that's fine. My machine has been known as Anonymous. That's my host name since 1992.
I guess the other question there was also all of the keys there were request. Let me go find that really quick. Status map. Okay, so we had IP request, MAC request, and interface request. I think all of those are pretty much demands and not requests, so we might as well just change all of those to remove request. Okay, shall be done. Next up, Doug.
So yeah, there was a comment from Lou that was on section 2.1, and I think that this is something that we just might have missed when we did the cleanup of the meta plugin terminology. He seems to think, and I tend to agree, that there's some verbiage there that makes it sound very meta plugin-ish, and what he highlighted was the implementation then determines which additional CNI plugins to call. And anyways, so I think that just seemed limiting from the thick plugin point of view. So maybe I could take a shot at making that a little bit more generic there.
Yeah, I actually took a look at that just before the meeting also, and I noticed it's actually worse. It's the very beginning. Right, the first sentence in the definition of the term implementation basically says it's a meta plugin, and that's not what we intended. The intent, I think, the reason we want to talk about implementation rather than meta plugin is to not bind ourselves to using a meta plugin.
Totally.
Yeah, right? But in the presence of restriction 1.1.4, there has to be a plugin. But I think the point here of using implementation is to have a spec that is not dependent on 1.1.4. So we should define the implementation. I suggested some wording to just be whatever makes the the consequences of the specification happen, right? And note that as long as 1.1.4 applies, that's going to be a plugin, and go that way.
Yeah, I sort of read it the same way, and that's probably my fault when I did the huge rewrite. The other thing that occurred to me, though, when I was reading that and thinking about the implications are there's a lot of other CNI-related things kind of sprinkled throughout the spec since we were sort of focusing on that in some ways. And so
not sort of. This is utterly and clearly, very explicitly
yes.
about programming CNI calls.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of stuff going on there. And if we were to take Peng's suggestion to the logical conclusion, there would theoretically be a spec for CNI-based meta plugins and sort of a generic spec for plugins that weren't necessarily CNI-based. And I guess what I mean by that is, for example, the config string in the network spec specifically talks about, CNI configuration. Now,
yeah, no, this is something. Yeah, I completely agree with you. Actually, right? We discussed this a long time ago, and we discussed, we could try for something more general, but we decided we would start with something that's just about driving CNI.
right.
I think we should admit that and be clear about that. So yeah, the implementation pretty much has to map onto calls to other CNI plugins because that's all we're trying to do right now.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think Peng's comment, though, at least I read it as seeming to imply that he might be interested in doing a plugin that did not actually call out to other CNI plugins, but used the same network spec annotations and status and things like that, but did not actually run other CNI plugins itself. And so I guess that was one of the reasons why I did not do the consolidation of the plugin part that we had talked about last time, which was another open issue at the top of the spec document. I was going to do that, but then when I had read Peng's comments, I decided to hold off on that a little bit to try to get some thoughts from the group here about maybe where we should move forward with that.
And this was an item for that I put later in the agenda, but yeah, Peng is interested in doing another reference implementation using Courier. So Courier is a way to essentially, for those that don't know, it's a way to connect your OpenStack implementation with Neutron to Kubernetes, or that's one way that you can use it. So anyways, I think that in his particular case, he's not interested in being a meta plugin and shelling to other CNI plugins. So I think that he might have been worried that he was going against the spec by doing it that way. And I'm like, it brings up a point that might need to be groomed a little there.
So I am familiar with Courier, at least I was a couple of years ago when I was using it for exactly this. I had a CNI plugin that invoked basically Courier, to use a Neutron virtual network to supply Kubernetes network connectivity. So I'm a little confused. I don't see why he would have a problem with writing a CNI plugin and letting it be called by the meta plugin that needs to be today's implementation.
I wish I could speak to that, but I can't exactly. So maybe I can get some clarification from him. He is based in Beijing, so this is not a great time of day for him.
Yeah, I think it's because they did some experimentation with Multis with the meta plugin already, and the current design it doesn't work too well when you call two things at the same time. So there's no protection
what do you mean
there.
by at the same time?
Because they're trying to implement multiple types of interfaces as well, like something like a user space interface as well as a Mac VLAN interface, and they wanted to plumb both of those types right into the pod in the courier deployment. So I think they had a lot of trouble with getting Multis to work. So they decided it's better to have Courier CNI to support both, to support multiple network or multiple interface.
I have to say I don't understand that. I wish we could hear from him directly.
Yeah.
Well, and it occurred to me that it should be possible to support that use case by, if we clean up the thick plugin stuff, then you would essentially have Multis in between, and then you would have the Courier plugin with the CNI config. I mean, it would basically just be the binary on disk, and then Multis would call the Courier plugin with the right network name. So it feels like it should be possible to support that case, but I do realize or understand that there's some inefficiency there because you have the meta plugin in between that would then just be calling Courier, and I assume they would prefer not to have that second layer in there.
Well, it sounds to me like the complaint is not about inefficiency, but it's not going to work. Fang, do you know?
That's correct. So I think, well, it doesn't work when you try to do multiple types, I think is the conclusion. I think it works okay if you only use like Mac VLAN like they use today. But I think if they now they are trying to do DPDK and others, so I think that makes it work less well.
I'm not familiar. So it's been a while, as I said, since I was familiar with Courier.
Sure.
Last I knew about Courier, it was not supporting multiple types concurrently.
Correct, and that's what they're adding now. So today it's being worked on. I think Intel is working on that. They are adding basically a second type of interface in Courier. And that's to support fast data path, right? So it's DPDK, that kind of stuff. So we can in fact get someone from Intel to come to this meeting too. Well, it's not a great time for them either, but potentially at one point we can get them to talk about their finding.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear what kind of problems they have with it.
Right. Yeah.
Like what the specific parallelism issues there are.
Yep.
It sounds like the issue is not so much parallel, it's just mixing two types.
I'm going to have to admit that I don't actually understand what you mean by mixing two types and why that would be a problem.
Well, it sounds like what Fang is saying is, just a minute.
Minute or second?
What I was saying is, it sounds like Fang is saying that the problem isn't so much one of concurrency. It's just if you independently ask Courier to make two types of attachments, it's even if it's one after the other, it's not going to work.
No, I think that works. Okay. Yeah, it's when you call them at the same time, it doesn't work.
Oh well, it's worth knowing. If that's all the only problem, Well, that is still kind of interesting, but maybe we could do something about saying, yeah, there needs to be serialization here.
Yeah, I think to resolve that, what you had to do is implement courier CNI in a different kind of way, right? So that.
Well, no, I mean, actually, I'm a little surprised at concurrency at all. I think when I was implementing stuff like this, the calls out to the individual attachment things were done serially. It's a pretty natural way to do the work.
Normally, do you have global data, which I assume that is not here, or do you have signaling overlaps rather than normally you're trying to serialize it, just like you said?
Yeah, I didn't quite hear you clearly, but
I said that either it's global data, which would surprise me really, really much, or it's like you just need to serialize somewhere. I mean, you just can't have two things running over the same data unless you're, I'll call it thread safe or whatever you want, but I mean, you need to protect your resources. I get really surprised when people have such problems today. Because the OS clearly doesn't have it. It has as nice serialization as it is.
And that kind of brings up the point that we don't actually address any of this in the spec. We don't specifically say that each of the attachments should be run in parallel or in serial. That's kind of left completely undefined. I'm wondering now if maybe we should have language about that.
Does CNI have language about that?
It does not.
I would be very disappointed if you specify that it has to be run in serial.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
But that in turn means you have to specify at the CNI level that things can be run in parallel.
Well, they can. I mean, again, CNI doesn't say anything about that. All it says is that an add operation for the given tuple.
So you could say that the CNI maybe is a little bit underspecified, but definitely not overspecified in this issue.
Casey, I'm sorry, Dan. You can't say that because CNI is silent on the issue, that means concurrency is allowed. To allow concurrency, you have to constrain the CNI implementation plugins to be thread safe.
Yes.
And I don't know, if it had been 10, 15 years ago, I would have said that yes, if you want concurrency, you need to say so. Now I would say if you can't handle concurrency, it needs to be specified specifically.
Well, so now I come back and ask, is Feng reporting that the courier CNI plugin is not thread safe?
But then the question is, should that have the right to impact the whole framework, or should that be a TR back on courier saying that you need to fix this? I don't know. I know what I would prefer, but
and I'm not sure we have answers to that question, at least from the courier perspective. So
yep. So what we can do is
how can you really be sure? I mean, let's say that for some reason someone runs two instances of Kubernetes on the same set of machines, like basically sliced up the machines, and then you use the same plugins at the bottom. So then the calls will come from two different controllers and just happen to come at the same time.
But in that case, it'll be going to different network namespaces, and it won't be an issue. Here, the concern is you've got concurrent calls to a CNI plugin trying to do work on the same network namespace concurrently.
yeah, I mean, especially in the case of multiple attachments, would our spec have anything to say there? Say you have two attachments to the same network. Are we allowed to run those attachments in parallel? It would seem.
So again, I think, given that we're discussing it, okay, we can't say that any answer goes without saying. We should say, okay.
So we can just have personal preference right here, I think. What we think is right, but.
Right. We should say it one way or the other. We should either say that they will be run serially, or the plugin, or we need CNI to say the plugins can be run concurrently.
Yes. Yeah. What I was saying was that 2018, to me, that it doesn't say anything explicitly, I always assume that it can be concurrent, whereas 15 years ago, I would have assumed the opposite. So I agree it's underspecified. So I think I agree with Mike that the CNI should specify this.
Okay, so notes I have for this are that we should explicitly say that attachments for a pod may be run in parallel, and that we should explore adding language to the CNI specification to say the same thing.
But that's a little weak. I think we cannot say they may be run in parallel until we are confident that CNI plugins allow concurrency.
You mean the CNI spec or the plugins themselves?
Well, I suppose at the end of the day, it's the implementations that matter, but we usually rely on the spec to.
Right.
So, I mean, it's in some sense. Let's see. Check with the CNI community, right? I mean, if they all believe that, oh yes, of course they all. Right? If they all say, oh, of course all our implementations support concurrency, then we just update the spec and move on. And if they find out they don't all support concurrency, then we're not going to be able to update the spec, and we have a problem.
Yep. Oh, sorry, I muted you.
A or B, right? Parallel or not parallel?
Can you say that again? I had you muted.
Me?
No, sorry, Per.
No, I said, I mean, we can say that the specification right now is underspecified, and it can be, you can read it and get both, and both ways of reading is correct, that it should not be parallel or it should be parallel. And we need to have a clarification which way it is, and we can live with it. We can have a preference.
Here's kind of a, I mean, maybe not smoking gun on the issue, but Kubernetes right now will allow parallel invocations of the same CNI plugin if you have two separate pods running or being started on the machine.
Yeah. So that would probably be a strong invocation. I mean, strong leniency to what it should say.
Yeah, that's not very strong to me.
Opposite, then Kubernetes has a big problem, right?
Well, what I'm saying is that if a plugin does not support parallel invocations right now, it is already broken with respect to Kubernetes because that happens.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but there are two importantly different degrees of parallelism. There's a concurrent invocations for different network namespaces, and then the stronger degree is concurrent invocations for the same network namespace.
When you say network namespace, are you talking about multiple attachments of the same pod to the same network?
The network doesn't matter. The point is it's the namespace, right?
When you say namespace, though, what do you mean? Do you mean the
Linux
Kubernetes namespace or the network namespace?
Linux network namespace.
Fair enough. Okay. Yes. And also, Cube has nothing to say about multiple attachments and concurrency for the same pod either.
Right. So there's no smoking gun on the issue we care about.
I guess that's true. All right. So what we should do is, let's see here.
I think we should take it up with the CNI community in general, and most particularly including the courier community, and see whether they all agree. Of course we support concurrent invocations on the same Linux network namespace, or they won't say that. And then we'll proceed accordingly.
All right, I've tried to capture that in the notes. All right, and then also, Feng, maybe for the next meeting, if we can try to get somebody from Courier to talk a little bit more about that. I think basically we probably will end up punting some of the issues that Peng raised until the next meeting.
Okay. And if nothing else, I will, if I can't get somebody, I will at least find out the exact problem that they are facing, and have a better, technical review of what's going on. So,
Okay, that would be great.
Yep.
And at the same time, I will do a review of the language and try to figure out what parts might be able to be easily updated for a more generic specification here. But let's try to get more information before the next meeting so that we don't make the wrong decisions. All right, what was up next, Doug? Network plugin readiness, is that correct?
Yeah, I wanted to bring this up. So I can remember in one of the earlier versions of this, I'd helped write the section, and we had basically said that shouldn't do anything till the network's ready, and that's up to whatever implementation. And I think Casey had a question about it at some point, and we had put it in current implementation details or something like that. But now I am running into it a little bit more head on, and so I'm kind of wondering if we need to specify anything more here now, because now what I'm kind of thinking is in my reference implementation, I'd like it specifically to have the implementation determine if it's ready, and so what am I trying to say? So I specifically want to tell it, this is how I want you to know that the network's ready, and then I want you to either wait until it's ready with some configurable delay, and then in this particular case, it's to keep the pods from crash looping. Anyway, so I wanted to bring that up and see if you guys had any feeling on it, and now I'm also at the same time reading this section over again. And you guys have any strong feelings on this? The implementation would then wait until cluster-wide default networks plugin CNI JSON was written there, and then write its own. So
yeah, and that's the part that would probably end up needing to change. The general impetus for some of this is that people don't really want to modify kubelet command line arguments. The other options for this are that you tell kubelet to go look in a different location for its CNI config files, and then your meta plugin writes its config file into that other place, and then it won't write its file into the other place until the default cluster-wide network writes its file to etc cni.net.d. That's one option. Another option would be modifying all third-party network plugins to allow a different directory for their config files, and then the implementation here of the spec would write its config file to etc cni.net.d and wait for the other stuff in the other directory. But that seems less plausible, because trying to get all the network plugins to update where they write their configs is probably a lost cause.
yeah, good point.
So the third option is to modify Kubernetes CNI driver to accept a network name that would then be the name of the file that the implementation writes to etc cni.net.d, so that Kubernetes would wait until a given named CNI config shows up, as opposed to just picking the first one that happens to exist. So there are a couple of different options. Unfortunately, two of them require changing Kubernetes either at runtime or at build time, source code wise, and so those are a little bit less useful for existing clusters.
Right. I think we should. I mean, we already decided we don't want to require changes to the code. I think you outlined something that's only a config change at runtime, which is allowed, and that's the one we have to use.
Well, I think, Doug, correct me if I'm wrong, you're proposing a third sort of option which might get around that.
Right. Yeah. And basically what I'm saying is some type of specification or allowance for the implementation itself to determine readiness.
But that would require Kube to consult it.
So in this particular case, what would happen is that Cube would start scheduling workloads on a node that it is determined is ready, as it knows by the presence of the config and etcni.net.d. But then the implementation would just basically wait until it got whatever semaphore it needed in order to say, okay, it's ready to go, and then have some type of configurable timeout to basically say, like, I didn't get my semaphore within this amount of time.
But I think, as Dan mentioned, the signal that the meta plugin, which is our initial implementation, is going to have to look for is presence of other CNI config files in etcni.d.
Right, and that's exactly how I would do it at first. Is in my particular case, is I just want to say, hey, I'm just waiting for this file to arrive there.
But the problem there is, if we make the meta plugin not write its file until some other file is present, right? Kube may latch on to the other thing and call it.
That's right, and that will get called on pod creation, right? So that's the race there. So what I'm kind of saying, or what I would anticipate doing, is I would have the config for the meta plugin be alphabetically first and always live there, and be whatever number1.conf.
Oh, so you're saying the config? Yeah, it starts there and just it pauses during as the invocation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. I think that's a plausible approach. Perhaps I'm a little nervous about pausing for who knows how long time. But I think we're debating something that's not a spec matter. I think this and the technique of using an alternate config directory are both allowed by Kube and can be allowed by the spec, and it's really an implementation detail that should be left open.
To some degree, though, when I did the rewrite of the spec, readiness is one of the things that we had identified was underspecified, and so I specified that and perhaps overspecified it. And that's section 6.1 in the spec, and it goes into a little bit of detail there, including saying
you're right. It's not.
The implementation should not indicate to Kubernetes that it is ready by writing or placing its CNI JSON configuration file in the Kube CNI config directory until the cluster-wide default network CNI JSON configuration file is available. So I mean, what Doug is probably requesting is, should we loosen that up to allow a situation like he suggests, where the implementation actually says, hey, I'm ready, immediately, but then blocks waiting for the default cluster-wide network to become ready.
Yeah, I'm okay with loosening it to allow that.
Okay.
Cool. I will volunteer to take on a small rewrite of this. It's this last paragraph of 6.1, I think, that just needs to be loosened up a little bit. I'll give it a shot, and I'll run it by you guys next time.
Okay. I added a note to the agenda that says that Doug will update the spec to allow implementations to indicate immediate readiness, but block pod networking until cluster-wide network is ready. Does that sound like what you understood, Doug?
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you guys for brainstorming that with me. I appreciate it.
All right. Last item on the agenda was additional reference implementation courier. Did we cover that already, or is there more you want to talk about on that, Doug?
I think that we've covered it sufficiently. So yeah, hopefully and it sounds like it already has brought up a few good issues. And so anyways, yeah, I'm just psyched that someone else is going to make a reference because we'll get more feedback on this specification. So anyways, I think it's good news for us. So yeah, hopefully we'll hear more from those guys as time goes on. That's all I've got on it.
I actually have a question about that. This is pushing another one of my buttons, my hot buttons in the networking group right now, which is the Pod Ready Plus proposal. I don't see how we can implement, as someone who's implementing networks based on Courier can implement the network policy contribution to Pod Ready Plus that we have defined.
Can you explain a little bit more, Mike?
Sure.
I haven't, unfortunately, kept track of that thread as much as I should have.
Sure. The concern is, my understanding of what we're saying, the way that network policy should contribute to Pod Ready Plus is basically indicating when all the filtering relevant to a new pod is in place. Since Pod Ready Plus is about getting a new pod ready. And the problem is that the filtering relevant to a new pod appears in two places, both adjacent to that pod and adjacent to all the remote correspondence that pod might try to communicate with. So to implement, first off, I expect that to implement network policy in a courier-based approach, you would be mapping that onto neutron security groups. Neutron security groups provide no feedback on when they're fully implemented. So say network policy implementation that delegates the filtering to security groups cannot tell when that delegated filtering is all in place.
This is because there's no channel of communication between those, or?
As far as I know, I mean, I haven't looked at it in a while, but when I last looked at Neutron, the interface for security groups gives no feedback about whether the filtering implied by a security group is fully in place.
Gotcha.
And again, the hard part is not the filtering that goes where you apply the security group, the port that you put it on, but on the other side, when a security group has a rule that refers to the remote peers as the members of this other security group, the problem is that the filtering for the first security group depends on the membership of the second security group. And so there's particularly no feedback about when all the consequences of that have been in place.
I will certainly give Peng a heads up about this particular time mark in the meeting, because I think that this will certainly interest him, because that's a pretty interesting interaction there for sure, that I'm not educated enough about. And the Pod Ready Plus nor Neutron, but it sounds like a pretty interesting scenario for sure.
Thank you.
I have a question also when you start talking about courier. Is there any talk about, I mean, under Neutron you have, I wouldn't say it's a fantastic, but it's there, the L4 interface. Are there any talks about the ingress services, Kubernetes, and sort of how that would be able to interact with the L4 services in Neutron and stuff like that? I take that as a no.
I don't have an answer either. I honestly know very little about OpenStack, generally speaking, but Peng is just an associate of mine, so I was kind of bringing the news here. So I don't. Others may know more than I.
Because I mean, in Kubernetes, we don't really specify L3 services, but we have the ingress and we have the proxy, right? and they're doing load balancing things. So I don't know if there is anything about how that would be implemented on top of each other, but I guess not. So that whole networking, how Courier really will work in the end, and to be able to sort of serve both masters and integrate it in a good way, it's something that I'm not scratching my head over it right now, but I will that in a couple of months it's going to sit in my lap.
All right, it seems like we've reached the end of that. Were there any other issues anybody wanted to bring up that were not on the agenda? Anybody who's been quiet? Casey, Callum, Jeff, Ivan, Dinesh?
So Dan, this is Dinesh.
Yes. Hi.
So I haven't reviewed the spec. I'm going to do that. So if there are comments, the best way would be to add a comment in the page itself.
Yep. Yeah. Just add a comment in the Google Doc. Select the part that you care about, and then add your comment there. And that's probably the best way to do it. It actually probably will. Right. It often has sparked some discussion. Other people will see those comments and then respond to them. The other thing you could do is in the Google Doc itself, there's kind of like the comment bubble in the top right. Make sure you turn on notifications. And so that if somebody replies to your comment, that you get an email or other indication that there's been a reply, so you can go respond to that reply or look and see.
Sure. Perfect.
So
Thank
that
you.
should help speed things up just a little bit.
Sure. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, all comments appreciated. I guess the last thing then is bike shedding on names. Doug and Mike have voted. Another suggestion I just thought of was shortening up network attachment template. Maybe that's better, maybe that's not. But again, if people have thoughts on what we should rename network, put your +1 at the top of the spec next to the one that you like. And maybe we'll try to narrow down at least some of the choices.
Yeah, so no, shortening it would be okay with me. I think we generally have a practice of not doing that, but at some point the names get so long that I'm willing to shorten them.
Yeah.
So since I only have 1 + 1 here, I'm not quite sure how I should indicate that would be okay with me.
I mean, I don't know, maybe just, I don't know, say that either one of these or one of them works for you. Do another +1 on the one you like, since it's sort of underneath the one you already voted for.
Okay.
We'll see if anybody else likes those better.
Okay.
So is network not a option?
I mean, I guess it could be an option, but I think Mike's point, and I mean, I at least sort of agree with Mike, is that network itself is not an accurate description of this object, because this object is a description of how you attach a pod to a network, as opposed to actually being the network itself. That network might live, elsewhere, like out in Neutron or somewhere.
Or it might, even more importantly, it might live in Kubernetes, and we might want to use the name network for the network.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's some valid objections to just keeping network. I've personally kept network in the doc for now because bike shedding is no fun and takes a long time. So, does that sort of answer your question, Fung?
Yep.
Okay. All right. If anybody else has anything, speak now. Otherwise, we're done.
Sounds
Okay,
good.
guys.
Thank you, gentlemen.
All right. See everybody in
Bye.
2 weeks.
Thanks.
Bye.
All right, catch you guys. Bye.